Welcome to the third event of the policy series. And welcome to Frank Gertner, who I'll introduce in a second. He's class of 1997. I'll introduce him properly, but my name is Dr. Jill Ruff. I am an officer on the board of directors for the DC chapter. I am a 1996 graduate, as my tagline says, and I went SWO for about 7.5 years, and then I transferred into the reserve component. And I've been drilling as an intel officer in the DC area since then. I am still drilling. Captain in the reserves, and enjoying it for now. We'll see. I probably got a few more years before I retire. But when I left active duty, I had to figure out what I wanted to do as a civilian. And the short answer was a big policy wonk, and I decided I was going to go back to school. And that was my life's calling. It was research and policy and academia, and public policy became my area of interest. And I do specifically national security policy and military personnel policies. So that's what I've been spending most of my career on. I'm currently affiliated with George Mason University, and I'm a distinguished visiting fellow there. Happy to follow up with anyone if you want to talk about Mason, if you got a kid going to Mason or grandkid going to Mason. We've got lots of wonderful connections here. Frank's with University of Maryland, so we can have the Maryland, DC, Virginia rivalry going on if we want to. But that's where we are. Basically, we wanted to launch these policy series because, you know, DC is just full of folks who think big thoughts, right? And we wanted to get together and be able to do that as a group. Particularly last year when we started this, there was so much going on with the pandemic. We had people at home, and we wanted to make sure that we could have connections formed within our alumni network and talk about issues of importance to them. And so that's why we have this session. This is a third event. The first event focused on modernizing selective service, so the draft system from Vietnam and what it might look like should we ever need to use it again. The second session was focused on the state of civil-military relations in America today. And today's session, as you all know, because you signed up, is about the economics of the all-volunteer force, or the AVF, because we're going to use that acronym for the rest of the time. And we're very excited to be here tonight. I want to go over a couple admin rules before I introduce Frank and we get started with our topic. But the first one is that we are using Zoom. For those, many of you are very familiar with this platform, but for those of you who are not, it is an open platform. We have small groups here, and we want you to be able to unmute and mute yourself at will so that you can chime in and participate in the conversation. It also means we like you to be muted if you're not speaking. So please mute yourself if you are not on mic. And if you want to raise your hand, for those who are not familiar, if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's mute and stop video, and then participants, chat, share screen, don't worry about it, record reactions is like a little happy face with a plus sign. If you click on that button, there's a series of icons. One's a hand. If you'd like to raise your hand, you can click on that, and that is a flag to me that you have a question or a comment and you want to participate in the conversation. You can raise your hand, or when we get to the point where we have interaction, you can unmute yourself, or you could just type into chat saying, I have something to say, and I'll call on you. So that's sort of our basic platform. Thanks, Eric. Got it. You can do your thumbs up, meaning you're tracking. But it's a very simple system, and it's designed to be interactive. Thanks, Robert. The second thing I'd like to add, our goal tonight is really engagement. We want to hear from you. Frank and I have a little bit of discussion that we'd like to present to you, and then we want to have an interactive dialogue. That's what both of us have talked about. We want to hear your thoughts. We want to hear from your background, your expertise, and what you think of the questions we're going to discuss tonight. So don't be shy. Next, I'd like to just formally introduce our guest speaker tonight. So I've mentioned this already, but Frank Gertner is a 97 grad. He is currently the Director of Military and Veterans Affairs and National Security Programs at the University of Maryland, specifically their Robert H. Smith School of Business. As the Director for Military Veterans Affairs, Frank leads career and business development amongst the military affiliated students, staff, faculty, their partners, and their alumni. As the Director of National Security Programs, he develops and oversees the business school's support to U.S. national security and defense innovation base. He also directs the Initiative for Veteran Lifelong Leadership, which is a collection of public platforms designed to explore, assess, and enhance the impact of veteran leadership on America's markets and their communities. So he is well suited tonight to talk about the economics of the all-volunteer force. We're very happy to have him here as a volunteer. So welcome, Frank.
Thanks, Jill.
Okay, so on to our topic. I'm going to speak just very briefly, and then I'm going to turn it over to Frank. Frank has less than a dozen slides. He's going to walk through, discuss, and then we're going to have a conversation for the remaining time that we have here. But we discussed how we might present this topic and sort of take that big picture view. So let me just briefly cover some overarching concepts. And it's just primarily just to set the stage. When we talk about the economics of the all-volunteer force, when scholars talk about it or when policymakers talk about it, they're not talking about the cost of the military, right? That's pretty obvious. We're talking about personnel costs because the cost of a tank or a destroyer doesn't change depending upon the status of the human that's operating it. We're talking about personnel costs. But we're not talking about all personnel costs, right? Some of them are fixed. So we couldn't possibly conceive of sending soldiers and sailors off to war and then only providing medical care to those who volunteered, right? So some of those costs are not what we discuss typically when we're talking about the costs of an all-volunteer force. The costs that pundits talk about, that policymakers talk about, are really pay and benefits and entitlements. They're talking about how to incentivize volunteers. And and many of you, certainly from our early classes, when the all-volunteer force was created, there was a commission. It was the President's Commission on the All-Volunteer Armed Force. It was known as the Gates Commission because of its director. They had quite a heated debate about whether the all-volunteer force would work. They were not necessarily certain that it would be sustainable over the long term. At the end of the day, after much, much debate, they decided that it was worth America giving a shot. Let's do it because I think we could get volunteers at an acceptable cost to the nation, okay? But everyone still had a little bit of caveat at the back of the report was, well, let's continue to reassess this because the cost could skyrocket over time. We're not quite sure what would happen when you get that all volunteer force. And again, for context, many of our older classes remember this. This was in 1970 that they were doing this commission. As President Nixon was running for election, and then one of his main platforms was ending the draft and shifting from conscription to an all-volunteer force. And that's exactly what they ended up doing. But they weren't sure what was going to happen. And so when we discuss today, and all-volunteer force has been around for almost 50 years. We're about to celebrate the 50-year anniversary of the all-volunteer force. The questions that linger are, is it sustainable? Is it effective, right? And you'd think after 50 years, and particularly after 20 years of war, those questions would be answered. But in the grand scheme of things, 50 years is not that long, right? We still have quite a bit to go. And there's plenty of folks who say that the volunteer model, where we have to incentivize personnel to join the military, is not where America should be. There's an ongoing debate about this. One of the more colorful personalities in this debate is a retired Major General Dennis Leitch. If you haven't heard of him, he has a book out called Skin in the Game, Poor Kids and Patriots. It was back in like 2013 area. But he is a very vocal advocate for the fact that, and these are his words, not mine, he thinks enlistment bonuses are bribes. Why should we have to pay people $40,000 to join the military? What kind of economic model are we setting up here for America? And 99% of Americans aren't in the military. So, in his opinion, we're devising this system in which we have a mercenary force that we are paying the less than 1% to go fight for us, right? Again, in his argument, this is not where America should be, economically speaking, or from a fairness perspective. I don't agree with everything General H says, but I think that he makes us stop and think about how we set up the military, how we recruit volunteers to the military, and how we should think about our personnel who are saying they do want to serve, right? and it's worth thinking about. I think when Frank and I discuss this, there's two components. That first part is who is in the force today. You know, we can talk about how you get the 18, 19-year-old to enlist and or join the officer corps, how to pay them, how to compensate them. Later on in the discussion, I'd really like to talk about how we do that for the more technical force. The Space Force was just created. You know, they're going to be competing against Silicon Valley. What does that look like for the military? Can America sustain that level of recruitment into a highly technical field? But the other aspect, aside from the 18, 19, 20-year-olds that we're trying to recruit in, as well as the specialties like the doctors, et cetera, is what are the life cycle costs of our people, right? How do we think about economics of the all-volunteer force, in particular the all-volunteer veterans? And that's where Frank comes in. Much of my work really revolves around the current military. Frank's work revolves around veterans in general and how we conceive of that entire economic case. And I think that we have had some early discussions. It's very interesting to me, and I hope it's interesting to you, but I'd like to turn the floor over to Frank to go through his slides. And again, if you wouldn't mind, let's hold questions until he completes his presentation. But let's have him go through, from his perspective, what America's veterans look like, how much they cost, how they compare, and then we can sort of open that floor for a wide variety of discussion. So with that, I will stop talking. Frank, the floor is yours, and you can screen share.
Great, thanks, Jill. And thanks everyone for joining us. As Jill mentioned, one of my roles at the University of Maryland's Smith School of Business is to direct the initiative for veteran lifelong leadership. And really our drive there is to identify, assess, and then promote the ROI of veteran employment on American society. But first, one component of ROI, of course, is figuring out what that investment is. What are we, how much do we actually invest in America's veterans? And a component of that, as Jill mentioned, is to consider the modern veteran and what is that long tail of the all-volunteer force, right? And so I'm just going to walk through kind of a couple of some of the statistics and some of the things to set the stage for a discussion around, how do, or, ways to account or start to account for America's all volunteer veterans and what we are, effectively costing the nation. So first I'll look at, the sort of where veterans sit in American society as a whole, right? We are at a modern low point when it comes to veteran representation as a percentage of American population. I think everyone kind of recognizes that. The high point, the post-World War II high point was 1970. Actually makes sense. 14% of the nation, actually, of the nation's population, both sexes, was veteran. Up to 40% of the adult male population was veteran. So about 40% of the workforce. And again, that makes sense because you had you still had World War II veterans largely in the workforce, and you had the Vietnam veterans and Korean War veterans all joining the workforce. So we hit about 14%. But since then, and as we've introduced the all-volunteer force, which started in the 70s, the percentage of the population has decreased dramatically, really, to the point where now we're about 6%. Veterans are about 6% of the US population, and projected to diminish further to 3% over the next 20 years, so by 2040. But then if you look at the per capita spend rate, in other words, the amount that each resident American is tied to veteran spending, it's actually quite a different picture. So for that dwindling population of veterans, the spend rate has gone from what was about $298 per person, and these are inflation adjusted, at $2020. In 1970, it peaked up a little bit in 1980, went down as we, during sort of the 90s. And then from 2000 to 2020, it has just skyrocketed in the post 9/11 era. So we currently, whereas for when we were at 14% of the population, each American was responsible in some capacity for about $298, right? Going towards veteran spending. Today, that number for 6% of the population is about $654. And one could argue that that's completely justifiable, right? After all, especially post 9/11 veterans, or what the VA would call Gulf War II veterans, are highly experienced, right? Highly technical. They're also highly compensated as they come out of the military. They've had real wage growth over the 15 of the past 20 years. Their median salaries are actually above, in many cases, their peers if they're at the 8-year mark. So at the 8-year mark, it's, an E5 is making generally $70,000. A lieutenant or an O3 is making about $108,000. If you adjust it for locality in the DC area, it's going to be about $10,000 more than that. That typically is higher than the average professional college graduate at the 8-year mark for their peers. They're highly educated, right? But also there's grown a culture, one could argue, that they expect to also be highly subsidized, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like in a minute. But, an interesting statistic is, that 37% of post 9/11 veterans qualify for VA disability in some measure. Now, again, to sort of the argument of, well, this could be, highly justifiable, right? The amount that we're investing in, why should we invest in veterans? And, the arguments for investing in veterans, in particular post 9/11 veterans, is they are, in addition, even though they're just a small portion of the population, they are a very trusted portion of the population, right? And consistently, as Gallup polls Americans on the institutions that they trust, the military is the only institution that consistently ranks above 75%, or it consistently scores above 75% on the trust meter for Americans. They, consistently, military leaders and then veteran leaders by implication, right, are considered to be, poll as being more ethical, transparent, empathetic than political, media, or tech industry leaders. It's a very diverse population, right? So there's an argument that they are bringing diversity and all that enables to their veteran communities, or to their communities as veterans. And then there's also an argument that they are, though veteran unemployment rates are actually lower than the general population, veterans are generally very unevenly employed. So 75% of the US top industries in the US continue to hire veterans at a lower rate than non-veterans. And there's an argument that a lot of employment support should be now diverted from addressing veteran unemployment, which is no longer really a problem, to addressing sort of the disparate, or addressing the fact that large portions of the American economy are still under hiring veterans, and veterans tend to be kind of therefore segmented, obviously, into the defense industry and the other industries to hire them at a high rate. But, the question ultimately that I think, we are on the verge of needing to discuss, I would argue, is how much ultimately is enough, right? And just to kind of set the stage for that discussion that I hope we can have here, at a macro level, how much are we actually investing in the veteran community? And this is just through federal programs, right? This doesn't account for nonprofit programs and VSO support and things like that. But the FY21 federal budget was $240 billion approved for the VA alone. And as in context, that is 300% what it was in 2001. And it actually is more than the combined budgets of DHS, the Department of State, Department of Justice, and NASA. And it's second to only to Department of Defense in terms of discretionary funding. And you could say, well, that was one administration. What about the next administration, right? And the next administration is actually upping the ante, right? So the FY22 budget just proposed actually represents a 10% increase roughly on the last year's budget for the VA. It rings in at just shy of $270 billion. And obviously then it's split between discretionary and mandatory funding. The vast majority of that budget, especially in the discretionary funding bucket, is to medical care, about 86%. And then you can see a lot of the other things that the VA is also allocating, or we are allocating money for the VA. And then, but the larger bucket is actually the mandatory spending, which it goes to VA pensions, compensation funds, disability programs, and then education, like the GI Bill. And so, the question then becomes, that's a lot of money. What does it buy us, right? And on one hand, a large, sort of the political argument is that it buys us, what we owe our veterans sort of intrinsically, right? The quote that now is apparently going to be changed, but is on the, we've traditionally used to define the mission for the VA, to care for those who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and for his orphan. So it's kind of an emotional appeal to veterans, right? We owe them. And then there's a national security aspect, right? George Washington sort of famously said that young people look to how the nation treats its veterans if they're going to join the military and serve in the future. But I think that as a nation and as a veteran community, we still owe each other a discussion about what does it cost us, not just in terms of monetary, not just in terms of dollars, but also in terms of offsets, especially as we sort of are entering now this era of great power competition. And just sort of to zoom in on one, way to think about that is the GI Bill alone costs $11 billion a year, right? What else would the nation, what's the equivalency of that $11 billion a year? So we're spending $11 billion a year on veteran education. That's nearly the cost of a Ford-class carrier. It's the cost of 2 Virginia-class submarines, or it's the cost of 5 new Arleigh Burke destroyers per year. So I guess the questions I'd love to sort of explore here tonight is, given that context, how will we know when we've spent enough on America's all-volunteer veterans, right? What parts of VA spending offer the greatest national return on investment, both societally, but then also in terms of economics? And then, what is the role of veterans in US national security, right? If we're investing in this population, not just because we owe them for what they've done, what is it that America should expect of its veterans in return for this really outsized investment in this dwindling or small and growing smaller population of the US public? So that concludes my sort of remarks, and I'd love to hear any thoughts you have on those questions or any others.
Thanks, Frank.
I will say that most of the implementation is asymmetrical, and that's always a challenge across the country. So the perception can be different. Over.
I'm sorry, most of the what was asymmetrical? The first word was garbled there.
Implementation. It's implemented differently in different states, different parts of the country. Less effectively in different parts of the country, and so the perception is different across the country on how effective what you just described is. Over.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just, chime in from anyone who hasn't been out west. I grew up out west, but, spending any time up in the sections where you're driving hours and hours and hours to get to the nearest VA clinic, that kind of care is very different from when you live in a metropolitan area. So the outcomes of the amount of money that Frank is talking about, if you wanted to just look at the outcomes, that would be a slightly different discussion, and it is worth having. But I think it's also worth having, just looking at the sheer increase in expenditure, which we have seen. Go ahead, Steve.
Those project those numbers, the 11 billion, to decrease as the percentage of vets in the population decreases over the next 20 years?
So no, I think if anything, they're projected to increase. The $11 billion for GI Bill that is just for the post 9/11 GI Bill, which has just recently become the Forever GI Bill, which means that every service member who joins the military now, once they've served for at least 3 years beyond their minimum obligation, they qualify for the post 9/11 GI Bill, or what will now be the Forever GI Bill. And then once they've served for beyond 12 years, as a retention bonus, they can transfer it to their kids or to their spouses, and there is no eclipse date on that. So that means that, and the GI Bill, if you notice, it's considered mandatory spending. It's non-discretionary spending. So that's effectively an entitlement that the nation will continue to pay for forever. If you kind of, if you consider I think the purposefully named title of the bill.
So how do you account for the decrease from 6% to 3% of population then? Because there's new kids coming in every day.
So the post 9/11 GI Bill is only eligible for the service members that are already part of that small population. So the decrease from 6% to 3% is because World War II and Korea War vets and gradually Vietnam vets will start to die. And that, as that population dwindles, then you really settle out at about 3% of the population, which is actually, if you look at it, 3% of the population is what the post Gulf War I and Gulf War II veterans combined comprise. So, at sort of steady state, I think ultimately, and Jill, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the projections would be that 3% will be steady state if we sustain the all volunteer force, without a huge increase, for a war or something like that.
Absent a conflict, I guess. Yeah.
Which is debatable. Let me go to Robert first. And he had his hand up earlier, and then Gil.
Yeah, it seems to me that it doesn't make a whole lot of difference whether all these veterans were accumulated from a conscript force or the all volunteer force. It's the same thing. We would be required socially and morally to compensate them for their service. So what are we discussing? It has to do with the economics of the all volunteer force. The question about whether we continue to recruit just volunteers for the military or have some form of conscription.
So your piece is that in a non-volunteer force, if you go back to the draft, we don't have to spend as much on the benefits like the GI Bill.
Yeah.
Well, that's debatable, right? So,
Right.
We have not had conscription since the 70s. If the Department of Defense is now exploring scenarios on what we might have to do should we get into some kind of great power competition. And I don't say this lightly, but I spent a year in Afghanistan. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were not great power competition. So if we had to conscript people, would all of the folks that we conscripted be eligible for the Forever GI Bill? And if so, what would that look like? And what would be the economic impact to the country of that kind of model? So to Robert's point, you know, it's not settled what kind of compensation we would give. Should we have to go to a hybrid model of some volunteers, some conscription? But it's certainly interesting things that we need to think about, because there's a price tag that goes along with all of that.
And I think I would add, you know, if you really drill into those numbers, I was just trying to kind of give a macro level view of, you know, how the current VA budget, you know, equates to traditionally what we spent, you know, on veterans. But if you drill down into the reasons for that ballooning budget, for the 300% increase in real terms over the last 20 years, it is not because there are more veterans. I mean, that much is clear. There are fewer veterans, but larger ballooning. It really is, you know, and there's a whole combination of reasons, but one of the reasons is because veteran benefits have expanded. So each veteran has more benefits. You know, the modern veteran has far more benefits than the Vietnam veteran did, or even the Gulf War I veteran did. And that was used in large part, in some cases, to address problems that could be identified, like veteran unemployment, right? In some cases, it was as a retention tool, like the post 9/11 GI Bill. And in some cases, it was because we are retaining all volunteer force veterans for longer than conscript veterans had served. And therefore, when they get out, they have more disabilities that they can claim compensation for, right? And so there's a whole, and then the third reason is because the VA, you know, is aging, right? Its facilities are aging, it needs to digitize. And so there's an enormous amount of money going into electronic health records, rebuilding facilities, building new facilities, and trying to sustain sort of all of the residual capital and modernize the residual capital that this enormous organization has built up over, 50 or almost 100 years.
Okay, so we've got a couple hands raised and we have a little bit of feedback on the line. So if you aren't up, please check your mute button. I'm going to go to Gil and then Eric. So Gil, you had your hand up?
Sure. Jill, thanks for including me. I snuck in here. I'm a non-USNA guy, but a Marine Corps vet. And Frank, I've got a host of questions for you. Let me just ask one off the bat. Are you aware of any studies that have been done looking at the possibility? I mean, I would kind of suspect that, in maybe not completely, but the GI Bill obviously has a lot of, positive outcomes, positive externalities, right? We have an awful lot of veterans that would not be getting potentially a 4-year degree, a 2-year degree, some other kind of work. There's a host of stuff you can do with it, but aren't getting a degree and therefore aren't using the military as a means of social mobility, which it's traditionally been for a host of reasons, but this obviously reinforces that, and B, contributing to a modern skills-based information economy in a way they may not have done otherwise. I mean, even then, I was always sometimes dismayed by really capable veterans, at least out of the gate, left the GI Bill on the shelf and didn't necessarily take advantage of it. But unquestionably, as a result of post 9/11, as expensive as it is compared to Montgomery, I think we have a lot of people going into higher education and presumably getting skills and contributing in a way they wouldn't have without that opportunity. So I'm wondering if there's been any studies looking at, does this maybe even out, or is this even a net benefit for society, despite, as I think you said, the equivalent of a super carrier cost a year?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Neil. And what I'd say is, yes, there are lots of studies that have been done and continue to be done around the benefit of the GI Bill to individual veterans, right? And the statistics do suggest that it is of undeniable benefit in terms of wealth, over time, right? In terms of education, obviously, and in terms of employment. So individual veterans, without doubt, are benefiting from the GI Bill. There has not been really any serious study about whether their communities are benefiting, right? Whether those GI Bill dollars are translating into additional jobs or whether they're translating into economic development. There's some suggestion that they are translating into entrepreneurship, like increased veteran entrepreneurship, and there are a lot of other even additional benefit, GI or VA benefits that go towards entrepreneurship. There has not been any serious study about whether or not that entrepreneurship is for sure decreasing veteran unemployment. It's not clear that veteran entrepreneurship is actually driving community development or jobs at a rate above non-veteran entrepreneurship. So those are things that actually we're looking to study. We've got, relationships with economic development commissions in Maryland, as well as at the state level and the VA. And so we're trying to kind of get some measurement around that to start to assess that. The other thing I would mention is that, the GI Bill, we tend to kind of blanket everything under the umbrella of the GI Bill, but the post 9/11 GI Bill, or what will now be called the Forever GI Bill, it really is a different animal. It's in a completely different universe from the Montgomery GI Bill, right? So that $11 billion a year is not on the GI Bill. It is just on the Forever GI Bill, because the Montgomery GI Bill is already, right? I mean, it's more like a Social Security account. I mean, soldiers, sailors, service members are paying into it, right? And then it's being, additionally subsidized by the VA. But, as a percentage of veterans benefits of that, mandatory spending, the post 9/11 GI Bill is actually double what the original GI Bill accounted for in the VA benefits budget. So, and what you're seeing is that actually I almost never see anyone actually at the university still using the Montgomery GI Bill, because the post 9/11 GI Bill is so generous that there really is no reason to ever use it. So even people that paid into the Montgomery GI Bill, they just transfer their benefits to the post 9/11 GI Bill.
One of those
Is that
guys,
because of the cost?
paid $1,000 and regret it.
Yeah, and I'll just give you an example. I mean, the post 9/11, let me just give you an example. This is why it adds up to $11 billion, right? So for an MBA at a public university, the post 9/11 GI Bill, number one, will pay for 100% of the tuition, okay? So that could be $130,000 in tuition. And in addition to that, it will pay E5 MHA per month. So that's another $65,000 over the course of 2 years. And in addition to that, it's paying a book stipend. So in other words, and that's only 2/3 of the benefit, right? For that MBA program. So for each individual veteran, the post 9/11 GI Bill is effectively a benefit of, $300,000 roughly, which far eclipses what the Montgomery GI Bill ever paid for anyone, even in the post-World War II era.
Yeah, if someone were to do that kind of a big study, I mean, even the officer enlisted breakdown in terms of positive societal impacts, I think would be pretty stark. But yeah, thank you.
Well, we'll see. I should connect you, and I'll add that Gil is with Catholic University. I'll probably connect you guys offline. But Frank posted something today. It is the anniversary of the Montgomery GI Bill, the original legislation. Many people think that created the middle class in America, radically transformed our economy after World War II. But the societal impacts of the current GI Bill are still questionable. The individual benefits, very high. Societal benefits, unknown at this point. Okay, so we've got 15 minutes left. Let me go to Eric and then Greg. So Eric, you're up.
Okay, hi. To piggyback on that discussion, my wife's in the room with me, and she's a classmate as well. We're both 2001 grads. But the question that she brought up, and she's in the other room right now, we're talking about MBAs. So I think it's worth pointing out that we might all be biased because we're Naval Academy grads. We have at least a bachelor's degree, and some of us have more than that. but there are a lot of veterans who are enlisted who are using that GI Bill benefit just to get their bachelor's degree. So they use that, what's left over to pursue a further education. I think that's a point worth thinking about. But my question now, with all the discussion about how much more expensive it is to compensate veterans with incentives like this, do we expect that the shift from the high 3 retirement model to the blended retirement system, will that eventually even things out? And if so, how long will it take?
Yeah, that's a great question. Frank, I'll give that one to you.
No, that is a great question. And I think what you're identifying, Eric, is actually something that I think is one of the biggest policy gaps that we have right now, which is that the military, DoD, thinks about how are we going to retain and account for the active force. And then the VA independently thinks about how are we going to sustain and invest in the veteran population. And they're not really they're left hand, right hand of the same body that are not really coordinating with each other when it comes to these policy discussions, right? So the answer, Eric, I don't know, but I would be surprised if there's that level of coordination happening. And just as an example, I mean, to go back on to the last conversation, yes, it is absolutely true that the post 9/11 GI Bill is an incredible benefit for many enlisted, but we are also increasing the TA funds, the tuition assistant funds in the military. So we spend on order of about, 500 million in TA, right, for the military. And so more and more enlisted are actually getting their degrees, especially through distance education, while they're on active duty, their bachelor's degree. So I actually see a growing population. The fastest growing population in MBA programs right now is enlisted coming out of the military with their degrees, using then their post 9/11 GI Bill to pursue advanced degrees, in some cases all the way to up through PhDs.
I think it's also worth noting, at least in my experience, and I just went over 20, but over the last 20 years, I've noticed a lot more junior enlisted are coming in later in life than, when I first came in, it was mostly people right out of high school, maybe a little bit of life experience. In my last sea tour, I was seeing guys in their early 30s coming in with college degrees, and they just wanted to do something different, so they were enlisting.
Yeah, that's great. That's an interesting point, Eric. And I would say that I see the same thing on the veteran population. We see the veterans who are coming out of the all-volunteer force being older and more educated and experienced as they start veteran life, right? And so that is the question, right? I think one of the questions is, the military, both the military and the VA need to start to understand that, the military, the all-volunteer force and the all-volunteer veteran, they are the same person, right? Over the course of a continuum that needs to be, that we have to, I think, ask seriously, what do we owe them? But then what do they owe us? And then, in the end, also, how much is enough, right? What do we owe them? Not just what do we owe them because they've served, but how do we justify to the 97% of the nation that is not them, what we're paying to them or what we're benefiting them?
All right, great conversations all around. I got Greg, then Gino, then Burley. So Greg, you're up.
Okay, well, the previous conversation changed my whole tempo. And so I'll do that. But okay, cyber and a lot of other things that you just discussed. There are a lot of things that the world has changed and we need to bring people in at a different level. And it's across the country. I'm a bachelor, so I joke about this, but my dad was in Iowa, got great care. In Maryland, I was here, and they rejected me for 5 years because they always had a conference party or a coffee party or something else. 2.5 hour drive, and we don't have time for you. The reason I say that is we need to take care of the veterans. I'm an old guy, so when I applied for the VA and the GI Bill, I was rejected. I'm a 1983 graduate, so I was in that transition period. But the point is that's not the point. We're taking care of our folks now. I do STEM things. I have women. I have folks I'm counseling across the supporting the company, supporting the DOD, and supporting the veterans, and of course, folks in service wearing uniform. So we want to take care of them. And what you just said was very good. I appreciate that. How do we make sure that we have a consistent information, a consistent source? Because I'm an 83 graduate, so we did telecommuting back in 83. I came from Iowa, so we did it. We had email back in the 83, 79. So we wanted to have that stuff cross-pollinating. So how do we make sure we take care of the folks that are going forward? We can't necessarily take care of all the folks in their 65 and 75 and everything else. We want to take care of them where we can. And as classmates, as veterans, we'll support them on a personal basis. We're not going to change the laws on those. But how do we take care of making sure the future veterans, what you just said, we bring them in on a bipartisan and looking at inclusive thing, because we really are looking at inclusive environment, especially going in the future. How do we bring in those folks? And some of those things we have to support for DOD can be done remotely. So we can have a petty officer that is a mother. How do we support her so she can do that? How do we support those folks remotely and make sure they can support those things in a manner that supports the Constitution, supports the government, but also values their life? Over.
Yeah, no, those are great points, Greg. And what I would have to say is that a component of this question, of this conversation, also is what does not so if you take as a given, and I think everyone on this call would take as a given that we owe our veterans support and lifelong support, right? And we would never want to erode the support beyond what they need. But there is a question within that, which is what aspect of that does the federal government need to be doing through entitlements and permanent programs versus what should the states be responsible for versus what are nonprofits responsible for? And that actually is not unprecedented in history. I mean, before World War I and really before World War II, large portions of the veteran veteran benefits were handled by places like the Grand Army of the Republic and and other non-federal programs.
And my question with that is okay, so my brother-in-law has heart disease, and my father had ALS. They got treated great in Iowa. I spent 7 years going up to Baltimore, and I've never been treated, never been processed. So my point is okay, there are areas that are much better than other parts. So do we tell the veterans, if you're really having problems, move out of Maryland and move into civilization? And unfortunately, that's a bad message to send, but it may be necessary to take care of our veterans. Over.
I think we'll want to get to some other questions, but there are major changes. One of the things that I didn't mention, and we'll see how these work out, but the discretionary versus non-discretionary, up until a couple of years ago, all of the medical expenses in the VA were considered mandatory spending. During the Trump administration, it was moved into discretionary spending, which is clear, and that's all part of the Mission CARES Act. And so, I think, there's no question that we are going to start to see more and more movement of a lot of the medical care into, into the non-VA medical system.
Good.
And we will see where costs go with that. Obviously, I think the hope is to control costs, but we'll have to see where that goes. I think, Greg, I think we want to go on to somebody else. So
yes, go. Please go on.
And thanks. Okay, so next up is Gino, and then we'll end with Burley since we're going to be at that point.
I'll be quick here because I had dental surgery today, so we can't talk too long. I have never used VA and I never used the GI Bill. So I'm not familiar with detail. I'm very glad I sat in today because I got quite an education from Frank. I thank both Frank and Jill for this because I had no idea the volume of activity in dollars. My question though is the costs going up? Are the costs where they are because of the way costs are going up in volume? For example, college educations. I happen to be looking at a site today for Mount St. Mary's in Emmitsburg, Virginia. $28,000 after aid a year. So I said, well, what is it before aid? It's $58,000. Now I'm not putting down Mount St. Mary's. It's a private liberal arts school of sorts, Catholic, etc. But I'm going. So is there more people in the stream, or the cost just going crazy, or a combination of both?
So I think it's a combination of both. In terms of more people in the stream, many more people, basically the post 9/11 GI Bill, unlike the Montgomery GI Bill, the post 9/11 GI Bill is, anyone is eligible for it. You don't have to pay into it. So you're eligible just by years of service, and you only have to serve 3 years of service to be, in fact, you only have to serve 90 days of service to be eligible for 50% of your GI Bill benefits. And then those benefits have gotten, quite generous. And then of course, the other piece is that they're not capped for public universities. And so, whereas the Montgomery GI Bill has a specific cap in the amount of tuition that it will pay out per year, the post 9/11 GI Bill is uncapped for public universities. And it also it's uncapped in the amount of yellow ribbon funds that it can contribute, in matching funds for private universities. And so as universities have escalated their costs, the post 9/11 GI Bill has just been sort of an open door to, for money to flow through to them. And then the other piece is that there's this military housing allowance that also follows veterans and now their family members and their kids, independent of whether they need it for housing. And that's all tax-free stipend. So, it's quite a flow of cash in the end. $11 billion a year. It's not a joke.
It's not. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, very generous. And obviously, I'm sure you've had kids go through college. Those costs are only going up. That's the direction that they will continue to go. So, okay, Burley, you're the last one. Take us home.
Okay, yes. As a member of the class of 67, I've taken advantage of all of these things at some level, but they were Montgomery level, not the new ones. The question I have really, obviously, this is, first of all, thank you very much for this. It's an eye-opener. I've never known the things that I've learned tonight. It's amazing. But the other side of this is, okay, so as a nation, we need our military, especially now. even more. How do we attract people into the military to do what we all know we have to do without something like this, if you will, to entice them to do so? And so in that sense, and I don't necessarily agree with all the things I've heard in terms of the outrageously expensive kinds of things that are being made available, and the lack of coordination between DoD and DVA. That's frankly stupid. But the point is, I believe this bill or this benefit has got to be a major factor in our ability to maintain a quality, educated, and dependable military, which we absolutely have to have. When you look at 3% of our nation are willing to serve, and why are they willing to serve? Partially because of what we're talking about tonight. So it's more of a statement than a question, but what role, Frank, do you think this incentive plays in our ability to attract the kind of military force we have to have as a nation to remain free?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, Burley. And I think there are two sides to that question. One is that you don't want to obviously start to decrease benefits without assessing the attractiveness, how much they're contributing to recruitment. But the other piece to it is that there is sort of a strange logic to the idea, I think, that we are trying to attract and then train a highly technical force, which we need them to have the skill set while they're serving. And so in order to attract and attract them and then train them for use of that highly technical skill set, we're going to offer them a benefit that's going to give them the degrees and the skills they need for the marketplace after they leave the military. So, at which point they've become a veteran. And as a nation, we're not really asking, so what does the nation need of its veterans? What's the veteran force's role in national security? And so one of the things that I think is kind of missing from this conversation is, number one, what is that handoff? What's the right handoff from the military as they recruit and train highly technical, all volunteer force personnel? What's the right handoff into the marketplace? But then second, if they're in the marketplace and we're going to give them an additional accelerant through the VA, then what do we expect of them after that as veterans? What's the role? Is there a role? I mean, and there's all sorts of things, as careers extend and things like that. Does this play into the idea of on-ramps and off-ramps of military service beyond what we currently do? Does it play into the idea of using selective reserve in a more effective capacity or a more active capacity? I mean, there's all sorts of, ways you can go with it. But as it currently stands, we're just accelerating this population and then assuming that that's good for the nation. And I would argue that that was probably fair when we were dealing with reasonably cost Montgomery GI Bill dollars. I don't think that's fair to the American public when we're dealing with $11 billion a year for 3% of the population effectively.
Well, and whether you think it's fair or not fair, it is unequivocally expensive. It is a generous program that is expensive to the country. So we should have a discussion about whether it's worth it and value add, right?
And I do apologize. I meandered into opinion there, but
I like your opinion, Frank. You share away. That's what we're here for. If I could just end on Burley's question real quick, and so my area really does look at the people coming into the force, not the veteran force like Frank's focus, and whether it's Constellation or not, You'd be unsurprised, I think, to know that the people who join the military today join for a wide variety of reasons, probably the same reasons that you joined or that you know of friends who joined. They joined because they want to serve the country, or they needed to get out of their small town, or they wanted to get out of their circumstances. They joined to travel, they joined for job opportunity, and they do join for benefits. This one in particular is showing that it has some value to recruiting. DoD has a section called Jammers. They track this. Jammers is showing that GI Bill is a powerful recruiting tool, but it's a nebulous one. You don't get into the specifics about how much money am I going to get for the books, how much is the stipend, what university can I get to. When you're trying to use this as a recruiting tool, you're saying you could go to college or your kids could go to college. So if someone's trying to get out of their circumstances and change their stars, you know, the fact that they could transfer this to their children, or they could use it one day later, because they're honestly not necessarily thinking about it right now, they could use it later, is a powerful recruiting tool. So it has shown value in recruiting, but from an intrinsic sense, not from a specifics sense. You could change the specifics. I don't think they would notice from the recruiting standpoint. So for what that's worth, DoD is trying to look at the impact of recruiting from the GI Bill in particular, because it's such an expensive entitlement. It's perceived as an entitlement now. But to bring us back to where we started, because we're over time here, we have to wrap up. America needs to either inspire or incentivize volunteers. Those are your two options. You inspire them to join the military for different reasons, where they need them, there's a conflict, or we want them to serve their nation, or you incentivize them through some means. And
Or
there's a
draft
wide variety of means to do.
Or draft them.
Or in the all-volunteer force, that's not an option. If we
compel
away
them,
from
right?
the all-volunteer force,
I
then
thought-
you're back to conscription, yes. So that's also a hot policy topic today. We can go back to that later, but for the economics tonight, thank you all for joining us. Thank you for participating in the discussion. I thought it was a very robust discussion. We are going to continue this series. We're taking the summer off. We'll be back in the fall, and we'll have a new topic up for debate then. And we hope you all can join us. So my thanks to Frank for sharing his wisdom with us tonight, and for all of you for joining online. 8:08, and we will see you next time at the GWC Chapter Policy Series.
Any chance we get Frank's slides?
Frank, would you like to share your slides? Are they shareable?
Yeah, I'm happy to share them. And I'll just leave with this closing thought. I used the post 9/11 GI Bill myself. But I also always ask every veteran, and I would encourage you to perhaps consider doing the same. Any veteran who's using these benefits, I always ask them, how are you going to make it count? Because right now it is incumbent on us as individuals to decide to make it count for society. And
You're going to do what? I'm sorry, what's the question for them?
No, I always ask them, how are you going to make it count?
Okay, good.
I think that goes well with our alumni motto, make sure we give it back, right?
Right.
We're here to give back no matter what our status, whether in uniform or out of uniform, and we're recipients of these benefits. I think Frank's point is very well taken.
It's well stated, but we need to help the current veterans get their benefits, because a lot of us did not. So how do we make sure they do not lose the veteran benefits that we did not get? So we want to make sure we take care of them. That's our job. Absolutely. As mentors, as veterans.
And good luck with that, Craig. And I appreciate you joining us and sharing your stories as well.
All right, thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Go Navy, beat Army.